A warm welcome to the first edition of Bharat Shakti, the Pondi Lit Fest 2018. For the inaugural session to discuss Bharat Shakti, India and the changing world, we welcome Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Specialist in Defense and Foreign Policy; Vivek De Broy, Chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Member, Niti Aayog; Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Historian and Urban Planner. The session will be moderated by Gautam Chikarmane, Senior Journalist, Writer and Vice President at ORF. We request all the speakers to please take their seat. Books by our session speakers are available on sale at Auradhan, our book launch venue, with other merchandise. We request you to keep your mobile phones on silent, though you are welcome to take videos and photographs without flash. Please tweet with the hashtag PondiLitFest, Instagram, and go live if you feel like it. This is a special request to our guest speakers in the audience. We welcome discourse and exchange, but please do keep it polite at all times. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. Pondi is like home to me. Several of the faces over here from Pondi are known to me, some very intimately, some as bypassers on the road when we cross the ashram. It's an absolute delight to be here. In fact, after this 2-minute silence that we had begun the session with, I didn't want to get out of the silence at all. But I think the session needs to be taken forward, and here we are. I want to begin this session with a little quote from Sri Aurobindo. This is on Bharat Shakti, and it's excerpted from I'm missing that book, Foundations of Indian Culture. Each nation is a Shakti or power of the evolving spirit in humanity and lives by the principle with which it embodies. India is the Bharat Shakti, the living energy of a great spiritual conception. And fidelity to it is the very principle of her existence. Extremely powerful words. There are other references to Bharat Shakti in one of the most powerful pieces that I've ever read called Bhavani Mandir. Those of you who have read it would feel energized simply by hearing those two words. Those who haven't must take some time out today and read those lines. They are, to me, the most inspiring lines about any nation across the world, across time, across space. Today's session, we are going to explore this theme, and I'm going to call upon our three experts here who, as one of them mentioned, and I quote, are all Bengalis who have been denied their free speech and are going to take all their time expressing it to their fullest. So my job becomes that much tougher in trying to control them. I'm neither a Bengali nor much of a speaker. I will invite them one by one. Abhijit for security, Sanjeev for economics, and Vivek for civilizational expressions of Bharat Shakti. Interspersed will also be this extremely disappointing, shocking incidents that have been happening around the Pondi Lit Fest, around free speech, around selective free speech. There are so many contradictions to be explored. At a surface level, I'm sure all of us have explored them, thought about them, discussed them. I think I will lean on our three experts here to go a little deeper into the idea of Bharat Shakti, free speech, and in general where we are headed. I'm going to divide this into three parts. First, about 5 minutes each, to express their free speech on Bharat Shakti as it relates to their fields. Next, a little bit about the controversy that's going on. I think we need to take it head on. We need to explore it, we need to debate it in all its entirety. In the third part, we'll go a little deeper into the philosophical dimensions of Bharat Shakti. Finally, we'll have some conversation and open it out. I'm sure all of you have several questions. You are all well read. Most of you, I see familiar faces who have gone through Sri Aurobindo's work in a far deeper way than I ever can. And I would lean on you to make our discussion richer. So I'm going to invite Abhijit first. Abhijit, in all our Shastras, in all our scriptures, in all that we have read on war, in all statecraft, etc., the first thing that comes is the state comes first. From the time of monarchies and kings till the later periods, we've always seen that you need to protect the state. The king needs to protect the state. Today, we don't have kings and those who govern us, as in different from those who rule us. Please make, this is a big difference between a ruling party and a governing coalition. And we tend to use the word rule. I don't know why we do it, it's wrong. It's a governance. So those who govern this country today and those who have ruled it in the past, all have kept the state, the security of the state as the first and the primary objective. How do you see that?
So, mostly I focus, one of the things I got told was that you learn a lot more about security in general if you oh, sorry. Okay. Is this better? Okay, great. So one of the first things I learned was, and I never understood this for a very long time, is that you understand security a lot better if you focus on the human element of it rather than the technology element of it. And what you're seeing with the bunch of security problems right now, so I'm going to focus on Bharat Shakti more in terms of what needs to happen really and a correct identification of the problem. The very fact that you brought up that we call it a ruling party rather than a governing coalition tells you what? That there's a lack of education. And that lack of education really is the core of our problems at the moment. You have a technology and policy education framework that's stuck somewhere in 1917 pre-World War I Europe that hasn't really moved beyond that and still sees technology in many cases as through the prism of an early industrial revolution prism. Now, let me give you examples of it, right? Take the army, for example. What you should be looking at is asymmetric defense against China. You want to fight a two-front war, that's the official doctrine. Much bigger numbers that you're facing down. What you should go in for is asymmetricity, smaller, leaner, meaner stuff. We don't. The Air Force, same thing. The Navy, for example, wants to concentrate on aircraft carriers when you can't even defend your current ships against submarines. So your foreign policy, for example, is similar. We still can't bring ourselves to say, I mean, China's come and invaded you. They keep sitting on your land, squatting on your land or whatever, and you still can't bring yourself to say that China is the enemy. You still can't bring yourself to say that you want to do something very nasty to Pakistan. So if you look at it individually in silos, you can say, you know, Nehru was responsible or XYZ was responsible. But the problem really is you've got an across-the-board failure of policy understanding, and that all goes back to human capacity. And that's where the educational crisis this country is facing comes in. So you really fix the human problems of it. So Bharat Shakti, what is the nation state? And this is where the genius of Aurobindo was, that he understood the nation state as its people. Every invocation to the goddess is, may the goddess come and live within the people. And that's where you really need to start investing in the people that make these policies, which we don't have. And of course, investing people also means that you need to have a fairly harsh and brutal approach to how you weed out people. So for example, in the Foreign Service or the IAS, the growth ladder is exactly vertical. If there were 100 people that got into the service, all those 100 people will become ambassador at some point of time, right? In the military, now let me give you the converse example. In the military, 95% of those selected will not make it to the top officer levels. And yet, decision-making in the military is just as abysmal as the decision-making in the civilian wings. So here's the point. You adopt a sort of management theory to it, and it's still failing in both cases, then you really need to sit and have a rethink. And that's the thing. Focus on the human being. Invest in the human being. Don't invest in technologies.
Thanks, Abhijit. Sanjeev, one notion of security of the state is economic security. Can you elaborate that?
Well, it's not a new thing. If you read Kautilya's Arthashastra, he very, very clearly makes the point that ultimately the greatest power derives for any state or civilization for that matter, derives ultimately from the artha or the economy of that state. So it is not a new idea, it's an old idea. Napoleon made the point about every army marches on its stomach. So this idea is a very old one. And I'm not saying anything particularly new. One of the interesting things is that for a very long time after independence, we were stuck with this rather povertarian view of the world. That we are a poor country, therefore everything that we kind of do has to be done in some shoddy, poor country sort of way. And this is the context in which I think you have to see what Atal Bihari ji did to our mindset. What he began to do, circa 2000, is suddenly say that, hey, we may be a poor country today, but we can build world-class things. So that was the first time when we began to do things like, for example, build the golden quadrilateral network of highways and say these have to be world-class highways. We began to think that, okay, we can build airports that can be world-class airports and so on and so forth. I mean, it is not just that the NDA won, but then that mindset shift even flowed through the two consecutive terms of UPA and then into NDA 2. But it was really a big shift that happened around about the 90s. Of course, I mentioned here Atal Bihari, but even the course of the 90s, you see that shift with the coming of our IT sectors, which go out there, compete without having import substitution barriers to protect them. So the very first time that this shift happens somewhere in the 90s, and this is a very important thing, because without this mental shift, we would be trapped eternally in this idea that, oh, we are poor, we can't compete. And this shows through in every field of intellectual activity, by the way. So just imagine, before independence, we had two Nobel laureates, one in physics, one in literature, in a time where we were a colonized country, where there was lots of racism, and yet we were able to produce two Nobel laureates. Now, since independence, it's interesting, no Indian living in India has been able to win a Nobel Prize in any subject. I'm not talking about the peace ones, which in fact reflect the failures of our society, but the ones that show some achievement as a society. So, not in literature, not in physics, medicine, or anything. Meanwhile, Indians living outside have typically been able to do it, so it's obviously not a genetic problem. So, the point is, we gave up this idea of excellence to be able to compete out, and it's only somewhere after in the 1991 with the reforms, but really starting with the Vajpayee era, that we began to see that we could reach and do big things. This is the context in which you have to see many of the things that are being done even today. When people talk about the bullet train, for example, sure, it's a very expensive form of transportation, but you see, we are beginning to think about creating things that are genuinely world class. And if you cannot think in those terms, then you will not try to compete in anything. Everywhere we will go, we will try to do something shoddy, because, oh, we are a poor country when we can only aspire to do shoddy things. That mindset has finally broken. So, the result of that is, of course, that in US dollar terms, our economy last year went past France to become the 6th largest economy. This year, as we speak, we have gone past Britain, and we are now the 5th largest economy in the world. And we are also, of course, the fastest growing economy of any size in the world. So it's only a matter of keeping this going, and we will slowly go past Germany and Japan and so forth. Of course, China and America are on a totally different scale from us. But nevertheless, the point is, in sheer economic scale, we have come a long, long way. And just to put it in context, as I said, we have gone past Britain in US dollar terms, GDP this year, but this has happened after 170 years. So the last time we were larger than Britain's economy was 170 years back. So this is not a trivial thing. Of course, in PPP terms, we were always significantly bigger for some time. But I have always, while PPP is a useful thing for welfarist discussions, in sheer economic power, you've got to take the US dollar value. And in US dollar value, we were simply not there. So finally, we have been growing. We are growing at serious rates. We are a serious sized economy. Now we've got to keep this going. And if we do not believe in keeping it going, then all this business of soft power doesn't work. Soft power works only when it is backed by hard power. And one part of that hard power is, of course, military power, but that is only, only in extreme situations do you actually exercise it. Economic hard power is something you exercise all the time. So economic hard power is very important, and if we need to think about our place in the world, we've got to think of economic hard power, but in that, we've got to change our mindset to think of ourselves as a genuine power. As long as we think of ourselves as some sort of a two-bit guy, oh, by the way, we should allow, thankfully, in that entire povertarian, we must work with the development agencies kind of mindset, we are not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, this povertarian thought has been pulling us down. Anytime you think of some mega project, you think, what about the poor? And this whataboutery has kept on focusing inward on our weaknesses rather than looking ahead. Also, just as one more ranking, India no longer houses the world's largest number of poor anymore. 3 years ago, that dishonor went to Nigeria. And I think by 2030, according to World Bank, there will not be a single person in India who will be under what is known as extreme poverty. I'll take that to Bibek now. Bibek, so we have security Shakti, we have economic Shakti, Artha Shakti. How do you look at Sri Aurobindo's work in the context of civilizational Shakti, the soul of our nation? Do you see any change that is happening? Maybe driven by economics, maybe by time, maybe because of a maturing of a free country?
Thank you, Gautam. Suprabhatam, Sarvebho Namaha. There is a reason why I said that, and I will come back to this. I will try and weave together some of the things that Abhijit and Sanjeev have already said. But before that, quickly on what you mentioned, and these two did not react to, freedom of expression. In many ways, not every way, in many ways, India today is defined by the Constitution. The Constitution of India as we have it today is not the Constitution that we had in 1950. There have been several amendments to the Indian Constitution, and I cannot see Anand here. Oh, there he is. I would recommend for those of you, Anand Ranganathan, I don't see him. For those of you who are not aware, I would suggest that you read up Anand's documentation of amendments to the Indian Constitution. And the reason I am flagging that is the First Amendment is of particular interest. And the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which was not done recently, it was done in the early 50s by the then Prime Minister, was because a rather critical article was published in a magazine known as Mainstream. And I think it would be of great edification if we passed on the details of that First Amendment and the mainstream article to the people who are likely to protest. But to come back to the Constitution does not say India. The Constitution says India, that is Bharat. And the reason I'm mentioning that is, in many respects, Bharat is much more expressive in terms of the nuance that has happened down thousands of years in terms of our civilization content, rather than the word India, which essentially, although we use it all the time today, was essentially a word that was externally imported and implanted. Gautam, you started off and Abhijit reacted to the role of the king. If I asked you, give me Indian, not necessarily Sanskrit words for the word king, you think of several words. There is Nripa and various other things. But one of the most common words that we had come up with is the Sanskrit Rajan or its equivalent Raja. Any Nripa is not Rajan. The Rajan word means someone who delights the subjects. Someone who causes delight to the subjects is Rajan. The first Rajan, according to our texts, was Prithu, after whom the earth became named Prithvi or Prithvi. There were Nripas before him. So Prithu was the first Rajan. He set out the rules for what today we would call governance. And indeed the role of the king was much more limited in those days, including in Kautilya's Arthashastra. The primary responsibility of the king, indeed the exclusive responsibility of the king, was defense, external security, internal security, an efficient dispute resolution system, protection of property rights, punishing the wicked, protecting the virtuous, full stop. Bharat Shakti is not about demanding that today's king, today's government do 30,000 things. Bharat Shakti, which inherently has to be defined with reference to Sanskriti and language, which is why I said Sarve Bho Namah. Because language itself is expressive of Sanskriti or culture. When I say Namaste, I bow down to you. Rare is the Indian steeped in Indian Sanskriti I have come across who will speak in English and will say, I am Bibek Debroy. The I does not figure prominently. It does not figure with a capital letter. The typical Indian will say, even if he or she is speaking in English, my name is Bibek Debroy. I, aham, is at the back. This Sanskriti is in our texts. And one of the points I want to make is the Namami, the National Manuscript Mission, has a list and an estimate, today is just an estimate, of about 40 million texts, puthis, out of which 95% have still not been translated. Will we leave it to the Harvards of the world and the Heidelbergs of the world to translate these, or will we collectively translate them? To understand what Bharat Shakti was, we need to discover what is in these texts. We need to discover the freedom of expression, the norms of civilization, civilized debate that exists in these. Before I debate with you, the standard practice was to state what your point of view is. And there have been actual instances of debates, descriptions of debates, where I have said, Abhijit, where Abhijit has said something and I am countering, and I have stated his position before I decide to counter it, and that in my exposition is what is called Purva Paksha. And Abhijit has come along and said, Vivekda, your statement of my Purva Paksha has been far better than what I myself said. This is the tradition of debate we had. But to come back to the king and the Rajan, who did the rest? The king did these minimal things. Who did the rest? The rest was done by the community. The rest was done by the individual. Who did ensured MRP in those days? The king did not. We did not need a competition commission of India. The Srenis did. Who ensured skill formation? The Srenis did. Who ensured unfair trade practices and restrictive business practices were not practiced? The Srenis did. And the individual. So Dharma had a three-layer structure. That three-layer structure had not just the king, the community and the individual. And practicing Swadharma, to me, is what Bharat Shakti is all about. Dharma in all of its three layers, and that is, the way I understand it, the message we have to the rest of the world, so that we can stand up and say, Srinantu Vishe Amritasya Putra. This is our understanding, this is our message of Bharat Shakti.
I'll just take this very eloquent argument one step behind. Before we get into expressing the Bharat Shakti, we need to become conscious of what this Shakti is. It is actually a coalition, a collation of all the souls, since we are now in the Indic way of thought, of the souls, each soul coming together, each soul performing its Swadharma, as you said, becoming part of a larger whole called the nation. It's not, Sri Aurobindo's vision of this Bharat Shakti is actually a much vaster vision of nationhood itself. This was written around the time 1905 to 1910, which was the time that Germany itself was coming together. That Shakti went in the wrong direction. But the idea of nationhood was springing up in one country after another, one nation at a time. It was that soul of the nation that was bringing this nationhood together. That soul is, I think, what we have somewhere left behind in our race for benchmarking ourselves to, let us say, economic growth, benchmarking ourselves to technology, looking at ourselves as something lower than what, forgetting those 95% of the 40 million texts that are yet to be translated. And even among those that have been translated, the Mahabharata, for instance, which contains everything that I would, in my limited way, say is about dharma, forgetting all that and knowing more about the other scriptures, of which I have no quarrel with, but are sincerely very inferior to the Mahabharata. I think that coming together of the soul is what Sri Aurobindo was talking about. Sanjeev, apart from economics, you are also an explorer of cultural affairs, of history. Could you shed some more light on this?
So I think when you talk about Bharat Shakti, you've got to understand, and as I, Vivekda said, Bharat is India as in Bharat. The word India is, of course, an expression of the nation state as it exists. But the word Bharat is about a civilizational nation. And that is very much at the core of who we are. And by the way, we are not even unique in being a civilizational nation. There are many other civilizational nations in the world. China looks at itself as a civilizational nation. Iran is a civilizational nation. Japan would consider itself a civilization. Israel is an attempt to create a civilizational nation. Whether it works or not is a different issue. So there are many other civilizational nations, and in our own history, there is a lot of talk about ancient Greece, and the Greek states used to fight amongst each other, but clearly when the Persians turned up, they behaved in a totally different way. So this idea of civilizational nation is also not new, and our own conception of ourselves as a civilization is very, very old. So when Shankaracharya sets up his 4 mutts, he doesn't randomly throw them around. He does it in the 4 corners of the earth. So there is a conception of a civilizational nation and also a broad overlay over a geographical space. This is very old. However, there is a very interesting aspect to this about this and our our interaction with Western modernity. And in that context, I think I need to tell you a little bit of history of Sri Aurobindo himself and his interaction with it. So Sri Aurobindo was, of course, one of the fathers of the Indian freedom movement and the revolutionary movement. When he came to Pondicherry, he was, of course, escaping arrest from the British. And when he came and settled here, circa 1909, 1910, he had no intention of going into the world of civilization, spirituality, and so on. He was a fugitive. His brother had just been packed off to Kalapani in the Andamans, and he was here basically as a fugitive, and he was continued to, in the first few years, to deal with all kinds of you have lots of, both from the Congress and the revolutionaries coming to meet him, and he was running all kinds of networks across the country. So that was what he was focused on. But then you see a shift, and the shift happens somewhere towards the end of the First World War. And his writings, it's quite interesting how he goes through this transition. He goes from an interest in the freedom movement directly to much more civilizational kinds of issues. So why does he do this? And at that time, by the way, many people criticized him that he had kind of left the field and run away, so to speak. So it is important to understand his own thinking and how it evolved. Basically, Sri Aurobindo came to the conclusion by around about 1918, 1920, that India would sooner or later get independence. Maybe if he worked a little harder, it would get it a few years earlier. If we didn't do anything, there were enough people, enough pressures, enough, the tide of history had already turned, so it was only a matter of time before India became independent. So therefore, he thought that his own personal contribution to it was going to be minimal. So his mind then shifted to a somewhat different problem. His view was that even if India got political freedom, India would not be truly free, because what was happening is that it was, particularly for the upper educated class, it was losing its moorings to its civilizational past. And it was losing it because effectively the educated class of his time, and this is quite interesting given the current context, the educated people of his time were beginning to sort of look down on these civilizational moorings and deliberately, in some cases, buying into the Western view of ourselves. As a result of which they began to look down on these moorings and actually themselves cut it off, not because of the others. Now, why did he come to this particular line of thought? Which, by the way, as I will show you, is something that later on both Edward Said in the context of the Middle East and V.S. Naipaul also in the context of India, but in many other countries, brought out. But why did he come to this conclusion? And it has to do with his own personal history. So you've got to go back to when Sri Aurobindo was growing up himself and his own family history. See, in the mid-19th century, what was going on was that there was a massive series of reform movements, particularly among the Hindus, but also amongst the Muslims, but particularly among the Hindus, as a response to imposition of Western ideas, many of them, especially after 1857, 58, after the British won, they became much more stringent about imposing their views. And of course, much of this was done through Christian missionaries and other things. And in response to that, many Hindu movements came about. One of these movements was, of course, the Brahmo Samaj, which started out as a Hindu reformist movement, and basically pushing back at the revolutionaries, at the missionaries, pushing back in many ways, using in old Indian texts to make the case that no, sati is a bad thing, and various modernist reforms. But by about the 1880s, it's quite interesting, a breakaway branch of the Brahmos began to make the argument that they were not Hindus at all, and began to westernize themselves in order to ingratiate themselves with the British, which of course the British encouraged. Now, they became increasingly positioning themselves as saying that no, we are actually, Western civilization is what it's really about, and they began to deliberately cut back on their links. And one of the people who did this was in fact Sri Aurobindo's own father. So Sri Aurobindo, when he was about 10 or 11, he and his brothers were packed off to Manchester, where they were kept with an English governess and deliberately kept away from any links to Indian community. So they were not sent to London but to Manchester, so that there would be no link. But at least London had some Indians living there even at that time. So they were deliberately kept up. They were given no exposure at all to their mother tongue, Bengali or any Indian language or any Indic cultural context, so that they would essentially grow up to become Englishmen. And the idea was that as a result of that, he would then come back as a brown Englishman and would sit for the civil service and then become a part of the empire as a bona fide member of the British Empire. Now what happens is that Sri Aurobindo goes through that whole process, but there was a flaw in his father's thinking, because when he went to Cambridge and began to study for the civil service exam, the civil service exam actually required him to learn Indian languages, because that was part of the training. So at the ripe old age of 16, 17, he then began to come back as a foreigner to learn Sanskrit and to learn Bengali, which he had, by the way, forgotten by this point in time. And by the way, this was a very traumatic experience. This whole thing was a very traumatic experience for his mother, who essentially became clinically depressed. And the net result of this is that Sri Aurobindo, coming back from the West and coming back to his culture, was very, very conscious of this idea that at some point our intellectual class would leave its linkages to Indic civilization. And so therefore, he said that the real danger to India and Indian civilization as a civilizational nationhood is not political freedom, which we will get anyway. The real danger in the long run is that this whole framework of Orientalism, which forces us to look at ourselves from a foreign perspective and therefore allows the foreign framer to control us for all time to come, that is the real danger. And so he began right here to begin to undermine that systematically. So that is the context in which we are sitting in this institution. It is very important to remember that.
And
Gautam,
as a
can I
result,
take it?
yeah.
I just want to take on that point.
Yeah.
I'm going to present a slight extension of this point, or maybe even a counterpoint. I don't know how it is. So if you read, and I admit I've got a very colonized mind on this, I'm very Occidental in my training. So if you read Huntington on who we are, which is basically an exploration of what the nation state is, what identity is, he's very clear about it's based on substance and salience. Substance is what connects us to each other, and salience is what makes us different from the other. It's the othering of the outsider, so to say. And what happens in this is, all the examples that both Vivek and Sanjeev brought out, ancient Indian thought, we know who we are, right? For example, the four mat set up by Adi Shankaracharya, we're very clear about who we are, what the extent of our land is. But the consciousness about who we are not, who is the other person, doesn't seem to exist. Because even that Mlecha hypothesis, so to say, isn't all that clear. We've always had history of people coming over and integrating with us. Like if you look at my grandmother who lives in Madras, she's white, she's got blue eyes because we've got a family history of people coming from what used to be called Kafristan. Now it's called Nuristan, because suddenly from Kafirs they saw the light and converted and so on and so forth. In the late 1700s, comes to Palagad, gets married, and we're still integrating people then, when apparently such things shouldn't have been possible. But let's take this on to security. What happens is, like you brought out, Gautam, that a lot of this was done when Germany was still in its formational stages, right? And there was what you call hyper-nationalism at that point. This was in security, we keep facing this question from people who keep coming here. Why aren't you focusing on human security? You're so focused on state security. Look at the individual. Is he being supplied with water? Is he being supplied with so on and so forth? Well, the problem is, in the East, we haven't even solved our state security problems. How do you move on to your human security problems? So there's this fundamental imposition of a Western order, that when Europe does nationalism, India slowly starts getting to that phase of nationalism, which is, I believe, currently very contextual to us, because we're surrounded by a whole host of very hostile states. And when we're surrounded by hostile states, just because Europe has solved its security problems by accepting American hegemony, that they can give up sovereignty, they can say borders don't count, they can say identity doesn't count. In Germany, even waving the German national flag is a dirty thing. To have that kind of a paradigm imposed on you, completely out of context, when it suits Europe, but not a place like India, where you've got every one of your neighbors ready to take out a little shaving knife and slit your throat, is one of the problems we face. Unthinking adoption of ideas. Now, I don't care if it's Chinese idea, Japanese idea, or a Western idea, but if you're going to impose an idea on India, and I do believe foreign examples are relevant, it's not even a cultural argument, it should be politically, economically contextual to us. And what you see right now, one of the big security problems we face, is this blind imposition of certain models which simply don't apply to us and are out of sync with time and context.
I want to shift the debate slightly, and because I think we have just about 10 more minutes before we open it out to the audience. I want to shift the debate to introspection. I think after we got independence, we just inherited some of the laws. I've just written a book on the economic laws, and what I find is that all of them, or most of them, at least till 1991, and following 1991 only because the rest of the world was in a certain way, are copy-pastes of the past. The Factories Act, I think when beginning my career, Bibek, that time you used to write a column, I think in Business World.
Today?
No, Business World. I was working in Business Today, and I used to read your column in Business World.
Business Standard.
Yeah, about the crazy laws of India. And I used to wait for that every week. And now, having gone through that rigor myself, I can testify that most of the problems that we see today in terms of the crushing of the Indian spirit, and in the world of Indian economics of the entrepreneur, are based on the laws that have been framed by the very same people who have simply shed their skin. We had whites governing us, and now the skin had changed, but the thinking hadn't. The Indian way was not looked at, it wasn't explored, it wasn't even studied. In fact, it was looked down with contempt. Chanakya, for instance, believed in a small state, but our state has gone into the deepest recesses. For instance, do you know that an entrepreneur, I don't know how many entrepreneurs are here, if you set up a factory, you need to create something called a spittoon, even today. And I don't know why it has been put into law. If you don't do it, there is a whole lot of bureaucracy to harass you. I think this entire edifice of law making, which is a continuation of controlling the natives, has been pushed into down our throats, and as a result of which we are where we are. I believe we could have grown faster, but that's debatable. I'd like to call on you, Bibek. What do you think of this?
Well, several things actually, but there's paucity of time. The first comment I'd like to make is that there is a great tendency, the moment you are in Parliament, to try and solve every problem in the world through passing legislation. Every problem in the world cannot be solved through legislation, and sometimes that legislation can be counterproductive. There are other countries in the world which have a system of what is called impact assessment before a statute is passed, so that you have to justify why you want to pass this particular piece of legislation, what are the benefits, what are the costs. Unfortunately, that's not quite done. It is ostensibly done in something called the Statement of Objects and Reasons, but done very perfunctorily. But you mentioned the colonial laws. Yes, agreed. By the way, there is a difference between a statute and rules under the statute. Rules are administrative law. So the spittoons is part of the rules of the Factories Act. It is not part of the statute of the Factories Act. Having said that, when we had a constitution, we should have scrutinized and revamped and junked all of this 19th century legislation. I still do not know, I still do not understand why we did not do it. We did it in a very fragmentary kind of way in the year 1960-61, but it was a very ad hoc kind of thing. The repeal of the old laws was done systematically first in 2001 when Arun Jaitley was the law minister, and the second time around now when under the Modi government, under 5 bills, about 1700 old laws have been repealed. When we are talking about repeal, please remember that sometimes it is not the case that you can repeal a statute in its entirety. When I said 1700, these are instances where the statute is being repealed in its entirety. In some cases, you might not want to be in a position to repeal a statute, you want to repeal a particular section of that, like the Transfer of Property Act, Section 69, stuff like that. However, let me mildly disagree with Gautam and say that in many respects the colonial laws were actually more liberal than some of the laws we passed in the 1960s and the 1970s. An example of that being the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act of 1947, which was passed initially under the Defence of India Act rules of 1939, was far more liberal than the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act of 1973. Exactly similarly, the Cooperative Societies Act of 1860-61 was far more liberal than the one we did subsequently. So yes, we should have got rid of the colonial deadwood, but yes, we should also take a look at the legislation that was passed between the end of the 60s and the end of the 70s. And the trouble with putting something on the statute book is that repealing it takes a lot of time. And I will quickly put in a footnote and say that the framers, I think, of the Constitution were much more aware of the civilizational content than we are today. And there were very conscious reasons why they kept out the words socialism and secularism. And one of the things that confronts the Indian nation state today is a questioning of what does socialism mean, a questioning of what does secularism mean, and a questioning of the form that democracy has taken in India today. Finally, the last word. I know we are going to revisit this tomorrow, but the last word. Sanjeev gave examples of civilizations. Notice, all of those civilizations have a single language. India is the only one we can think of where we have multiple languages. And this is an issue we need to talk about, probably not now, but in the course of the next 2 days.
So, I think we've highlighted the problems enough. So, suppose we were to change the way we make our laws. Suppose we were to go to law making 1.0 from today. Suppose we wish to embed the soul of India, the soul of Indians, the Indian needs, the Indian requirements, take those into cognizance before we copy-paste laws which are very elegantly written in the English language, either from Australia, UK or America. What would be the 2 or 3 parameters, Sanjeev, that you would look at?
So
I believe we have forgotten Indians in the making of laws for India.
So, very important that you first have a philosophy of what the state is supposed to do, because only then will you know what the laws are for. And again, going back to not remembering our own civilizational roots and debates, the point is that India has a very long history of thinking through the role of the state. Of course, everybody knows about Kautilya's Arthashastra, but there are many others. So Kamandak's Niti Sara and so on, which people don't even...
Shanti Parva in the Mahabharata.
Exactly, many others. So I'm going to, because I have very limited time, contrast between 2 views of what the state should be doing. That has been a debate for a long, long time, which is between the Kautilyan state and the Ashokan state. Now the Kautilyan state is very, very interesting. The Kautilyan state is not, by the way, a liberal state or a libertarian state. Kautilya is very, very clear that on those things the state does, it is pretty absolute. And if necessary, brute strength, the Danda Niti has to be used. However, it is quite interesting also that repeatedly Kautilya, right from the beginning, says the very most important thing about the king is that the king must be restrained. He every time keeps talking about this. So limiting the state is a very important part of what Kautilya is saying. He wants a strong state, but a limited state. This is very, very important. Kautilya is not a welfare. There may be welfarist things that Kautilya did, but the state itself is not welfarist in any meaningful way. In fact, one of the interesting things philosophically is the limiting factor of in Western philosophy of the state is freedom. The state must be limited because the citizens need to be given freedom. But in the Indian context, in the Kautilyan context, the limiting factor of the state is very clear. It is that the government official is inherently corrupt. So Kautilya says the state has to be curbed because the civil servant is inherently corrupt. In fact, he has a very well-known statement, just like a fish is swimming in water and you cannot tell how much water it is drinking, in the same way you cannot tell whether a government official is skimming from the government treasury. So this is a very interesting philosophical context. So anyway, he limits the state. Now there is the Ashokan context. Ashoka in his edict says, I am the father to my people. And just like a mother gives her child to a nanny, I have handed over my people to my officials. You can see a very different conception of the state with himself as the father, my Baap state. And then he gives these very detailed injunctions about how these people should look after. And by the way, the officials who are supposed to look after the people are called Dharma Mahamaktas, which in modern terms would be called religious police. Now, these are 2 very different conceptions. And after independence, we eulogized the Ashokan conception of the state. That is why Ashoka became the great. It is not in our tradition, it's not obvious Ashoka is the state. And now, to come to the question is, we need to decide which of the 2 or what combination of the 2 we need to opt for. I am very much a Kautilyan. The fact is, Kautilya created the great Mauryan Empire. The Mauryan Empire collapsed under Ashoka's watch. It didn't collapse after him, it collapsed while he was alive. So as far as I'm concerned, a strong but limited state is what we should aim for, not a weak but all-pervasive state, which is what we have ended up with.
I'll just call Abhijit and then Vivek. Abhijit, quick, 2 or 3 things that you would like to see in the security of our nation. that needs to be changed. You mentioned the relative disequilibrium between the private bureaucracy and the professional army. Anything else?
Well, you know, unfortunately, defense is, it's one of those things that doesn't lend itself to philosophy too well. It's one of those things where it's very clear that you just go and you do what you need to do. You follow orders. You don't really have time to philosophize about these things. So my thing is to take on from human training is also to take on what some of the points that were made here is that you need to be quite clear-headed about this. There is an unfortunate tendency, and this is where I kind of oppose the how do you say it? The indicization of defense thought in this country. I actually had a panel once where we were sitting for the government and coming up with a national security doctrine because people were so airy-fairy about is China an enemy? Is Pakistan an enemy? To come across a single government document that would provide guidance to every one of the bureaucrats, and none of us like bureaucrats here. So to come up with this guidance. And the problem was we actually had somebody, a very respected person who you would have all heard of, say that, do we really need a written document? The Vedas were never written down. So why do we need a written direction? Now this is fine for a state in the classical, in antiquity. But to have a modern state running without clear directions is a bit problematic. So I find that sometimes, you know, that the Indic thought coming into defense, I take great umbrage to it very frequently. So just to give that counterpoint out there, that I agree with all of you, but sometimes we have to take a very, very hard approach. In a way, Kautilya took that hard approach. He takes up issues that even Machiavelli shied away from. And that sadly is lacking. What we find is that this entire philosophical approach coming into security thinking, be it foreign policy or defense, where I've had questions of, I deal with, you know, nuclear, how to use nuclear weapons and how to do nuclear war fighting and things. And we have questions asked, which I'm like, you're a military officer. You have no business asking that question. You do what your leader tells you to do. The philosophy ends with the leader. It doesn't go into the military thinking. And yet this is what we're stuck with. So I'd say, like Kautilya said, the king must act in restraint. Indic thought should certainly act in restraint in where you infuse it into within the security structures of the country.
So I completely disagree with that, Abhijit, but maybe we can discuss the fight over lunch. Vivek, what should we do looking forward that brings the soul of our country into the practical lawmaking, practical day-to-day life?
Well, that is simple enough, Atmanang Vidhi, but I wanted to react because he provoked me by mentioning Ashoka. And I wanted to say two things. One, of course, Sanjeev has said, but I'll just endorse it and say that there was no Ashokan state. There was a Mauryan state. And I do not personally think Ashoka would have been able to do what he had done without the administrative setup set up by Kautilya and the revenue set up by Kautilya.
Which he destroyed.
Which is one reason why the Maurya Empire lasted for exactly 50 years around that after Ashoka. But bear with me a little bit. I want to make another point about Ashoka. And bear with me a little bit because I am going to take you back to the Bhagavad Gita. But rest assured, it is just the first chapter, and rest assured, it is just the first 2.5 shlokas, and there is a reason why I am saying this. Dhritarashtra uvacha dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yutsava mamaka pandavashaiva kimakurvata Sanjaya. Sanjaya uvacha. Drishtva tu pandavanikang vuran durya dhanastada acharyam upasangyam raja vachanam ravit. What did Duryodhan say? Pashya etan panduputranam. Etan, these. Subsequently, when he describes his own army, he says those. Words that are rarely translated in any Bhagavad Gita translation. When Duryodhan is referring to his army, those. When he is referring to the Pandava army, these. When Krishna and Arjuna are speaking in the first chapter, the chariot is stationed in front of the Kaurava army. So Duryodhan, Bhishma, they are in front of the Pandava army, and Arjuna and Krishna are in front of the Kaurava army. Now what is the point I am making? The point I am making is there were very clear rules of dharma, of fighting. When the trumpet sounded, when the conch shells were blown, you started to fight. Before that, you were friends. When the sun set, you did not fight. We read reports of the Kalinga war, and we read reports that Ashoka turned to non-violence. The river Daya was filled with blood. And edict number 13, if you read edict number 13, it just says that Ashoka was struck because he had violated dharma. It does not mention non-violence. Non-violence is part of war, and how many people were killed? 50,000, 100,000, that's about it. The point about the Kalinga war was that it was civilians who were killed. Collateral damage. So the reason Ashoka, in my understanding of edict number 13, was so overwhelmed is because he had violated the dharma of fighting. It wasn't so much a violence, non-violence issue. And coming back to dharma, so dharma sets bounds. Yes, in this day and age, some of that dharma has to be codified, but not everything can be codified, and the rest of it is for the community and we as individuals to take charge, and that is our Swadharma.
Thank you, Vivek. I'm going to open it out. I had seen Anand somewhere. Is he still here?
Yeah, he's there.
Anand? No, he's not here. Okay, I'm going to call two people, and after which, please raise your hand, and I'll open it out to you. Devdeep, can I call upon you to shed some light on Sri Aurobindo's work? It's something that you teach in the school, and it's something that you are fairly conversant with. If somebody can give him a mic. Particularly the bit about the soul.
I have a little question, if I may put it to you. It's a paradox that Sri Aurobindo brings up in his writings on Indian polity, in the foundations of Indian culture. And it's also something that he brings up in the ideal of human unity. So we've been talking about the primacy of the state and the importance of a powerful structure of government. At the same time, the paradox is that some of the most productive periods of Indian history from a cultural and spiritual perspective have been those in which the country has actually been, I wouldn't say divided, but lived in smaller collectivities. So, take for example the period historically which we refer to as the Mahajanapada period, where we have 16, 17 states which cover the central and northern parts of India. And some of the most interesting cultural, spiritual projects, if I may say, of India emerged at that time. And these states were themselves governed in various fashions. Some were oligarchic, some were some kind of simple monarchies, but there was definitely a streak of democracy that ran through all of them. So the reconciliation that I am thinking about is how do we reconcile a powerful centralized state with the fact that culturally and spiritually we have been the most productive when there has been much more local governance.
You want me to answer?
Yeah. Fantastic question. Thanks.
So the Chinese have a saying for this. They say, "May you live in interesting times." And the reason they say so is that indeed periods of instability are also periods of great creativity, because many of the old structures go and it is now free enough to allow you to innovate in any which way. So it's not even true just for India. You take, for example, the European Renaissance didn't happen in some great empire. It happened in small city-states in northern Italy. And then it spread to, guess where? To the Dutch cities, merchant states, which are also very small. So, and these were periods of enormous chaos. I mean, there were wars going on everywhere. And so creativity happened because these wars and instability and these smaller units allowed a variety of ideas to come out without too much restraint of the outside. So in some ways you're absolutely right that there have been, not always, there have been periods of instability that have led to creativity. That doesn't mean that every period of instability leads to it and therefore we should aspire for instability. That's not the case. I mean, the ISIS have left Iraq and Syria in devastation doesn't mean there's a lot of creativity happening there. But so yes, you're right that even in India this kind of thing happened, but it is also the case that there were periods of great creativity with large empires, the Gupta Empire being another one. So I think the key here is not whether it is a large states and small states and so on, but whether society was arranged at that point in time which allowed for a great deal of creativity of various kinds to happen. And I would argue here that between 1950 and 1991, we had a period of a one family, one ideology system that really scringed our creativity in multiple ways. Of course, in business because of the license Raj, but as I gave you the example, we didn't after that create a single Nobel laureate ever since. Even the one gold we used to win in hockey, we stopped winning because you created a state which stifled everybody and forced them to go. And incidentally, I grew up in the pinnacle of that kind of mindset, which was Kolkata. So not only were we in a socialist state, I was growing up in a communist-ruled city where no creativity was allowed. And in fact, all the intellectual institutions of Kolkata didn't decline. They were killed, and I am a witness of that murder. So this is what happened. So the question is, do we create, and this comes back to our first talk about freedom of speech and allowing new ideas to flourish, is not about small or big states and so on, or whether what matters is whether or not we have a society and a structure which allows for all kinds of new ideas to flourish. As long as these ideas are not directly leading to some form of violence, they should all be allowed to flourish. Why should there be only one idea of India? Let 1,000 ideas of India flourish.
Yeah, please.
I want to react to that question, but somewhat differently, and I should finally at least pretend to be an economist. I don't think there is any paradox. It is all a question of providing certain public goods and services. And depending on that public good or service, it is optimally produced at a certain level of centralization because of economies of scale or scope or whatever you choose to call it. And certain other public goods and services are optimally produced at lower levels, and so on and so forth. A strong state has to be defined with respect, a strong centralized state has to be defined with respect to what you want it to do, which is the expression that Sanjeev used. And that definition of the core state, centralized state, is the kinds of things that the Raja was supposed to do. Defense, external security, internal security, law and order, etc., etc. Below that, decentralization, and indeed several people have argued that India, even in comparison with China, has become excessively centralized, earlier for colonial reasons and subsequently for planning reasons. And look at this, all of us sitting here, we will constantly use the word center state, suggesting there is a center sitting there and everything else is a periphery. For God's sake, why? The word center does not figure in the Constitution anywhere. In the Constitution, it is union. So a commission, an official commission that was set up, calls itself the Commission on Center-State Relations. So yes, there is decentralization, but what I think has been lacking is the thing that I want to keep harping, is the role of the community and the individual. You did not need the danda of CSR for communities to do things. They did it. The purta karma, the civic works were done by communities and individuals. And I'm not talking about thousands of years back. The British authored gazetteers, initially nationwide, subsequently district. Offhand, I can think of the Rohtak district gazetteer for the year 1883. Go look it up. What is happening in Rohtak? In Rohtak, a canal is being built for irrigation purposes. How much does it cost? I forget the exact decimal figure, but roughly in 1883, it cost 45,000 rupees. 1883 rupees. How much did the government pay? 20,000. Who paid the remaining 25,000 in 1883? The community. You try to suggest this in the India of today, God knows what will happen. And mind you, the tax GDP ratio is more or less the same in Kautilya and today. Today it's 17% of GDP, Kautilya it is 16.96% of GDP. Exactly the same. But we expect the state to do many more things, and we will abdicate our responsibility.
Thank you. I want to call Richard. We've been talking about several civilizations, and the dominating discourse has been of clash. And even out here we mentioned several other civilizations. You have a different argument here. You say there is a clasp of civilizations coming together. You talk about it in the context of Sri Aurobindo's work.
I don't know that I'm going to have time to get into that. Could I save it for tomorrow? I'm sure that there must be questions from the audience.
Fine, no problem.
Okay, yeah.
It's open for everyone. Yes, sir, please.
And there's a gentleman there.
So, Abhijit, you mentioned about being open to outside ideas, about the importance of having a non-Indic perspectives and security narratives, right? So, but you also seem to lay stress on the investing in the individual, but it seemed to come across as though we should neglect technology. Do you really think we can invest in the individual to the exclusion of technology today? That's one question. The second question is to Dr. Debroy. Sanjeev has talked about how important it is for India to develop as an economy, and that leads to power. But it comes with its own challenges, as we know, environmental, so many other challenges. You spoke about dharma as being a central part of the Bharat Shakti narrative. How is it possible to reconcile some of these demands that are coming out of economic progress with what we have understood as dharma? There seem to be so many definitions of dharma. How do you propose we try to gain a consensus on what is our real dharma?
Abhijit?
So it is precisely because you want technology that you invest in human beings. Technology doesn't create itself. Humans create technology. Even the best supercomputer today or artificial intelligence today is nothing compared to the human brain, and it is created by human beings. So, just before we came here, we were doing these interviews at the writers thing, and one of the people I was interviewing was Arun Ram, who's co-authored this book on the ISRO spy case, where this one of the founding fathers of our cryogenic engine was arrested. He was accused of espionage and passing on cryogenic engine secrets to Pakistan, tortured in jail, and finally acquitted and everything. And nobody that did any of that to him was punished. Now, the point there was, across the board, there was this belief that somehow simply giving blueprints and buying technology equaled technological process. Blueprints are not technological process. Technology has two elements. One is the how, and the second is the why, right? How do you put it together? The why is the deep understanding of why it does 2 plus 2. We all know 2 plus 2 equals 4, but we don't know why 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that's where you become a serious mathematician. And that's the problem out here. In India, we always seem to be focusing on the how, but not the why. What I'm saying is when you focus on the human being, you're focusing not just on the how, but also on the why. So focus not on the hardware, focus on the software, and the hardware just follows automatically.
Vivek?
This probably requires a long answer, but let me give a short answer. I use the word dharma. I did not even attempt to use any English equivalent. There aren't many definitions of dharma. The definition of dharma is pretty straightforward. Yah dharyate sah dharma. That which holds up is dharma. There are different layers of dharma. And dharma cannot be translated as religion. There is dharma in the nature of Raja Dharma that we have been talking about. There is Swadharma that each one of us have to follow. There is a template of Varnashram Dharma, and the word Varna and the word Ashrama should also not be misunderstood. And there is a certain dharma that is moksha dharma. In all of these, the protection of the environment is deeply, deeply embedded, because whatever definition of sustainable development you come up with, it is about the cost to the future generation. And in that entire template of our dharma, articulated or stated by what Prithu did and various other things, including the Atharva Ved, this earth to us is given to us in trust. We just hold it temporarily to be passed on to the future generations. What better definition of sustainable development can there be? We don't necessarily need the Brandt Commission if we simply went back and read our own texts.
Thank you. Somebody there. I'll come back to you. And you. Yeah, please, sir.
In the public, we are normally perceived as a very soft state. And if we look at our gods and goddesses, almost all of them have weapons in their hands. There was a time when we used to talk of power and force and discipline and all that. So where has it vanished? And the second part of the question is, do we need to have a compulsory military training for our younger generation? It's for you.
So we have only 5 minutes, so let's try and get as many questions.
So I've always been from the Ambedkar school of compulsory military training, which is yes, because and it's more for social reasons, it isn't just for security reasons, which is it acts as a great social binder. And the clearest you see this is in Israel, where you have different Jews from different ethnicities, great deal of social mistrust, which all gets overcome within the army framework. But then getting to the first part of your question, which is, I belong to the school of, I prefer anthropological readings to, say, Indic readings in that sense. And in that sense, you'll find that violence, significant state violence, is absolutely necessary to maintain law and order. And that is why it is always a combination of factors. It is both carrots and it is sticks. And I have never shied away from violence. I even find the definition of dharma a bit too restrictive for me. Because if you want to state, my only disagreement with the gentleman who came and asked that previous question about small states is that when you have a large empire, you require fewer resources. It's a question of economies of scale. You require fewer resources to maintain the same rules over a larger part. The Mongol Empire, born of great violence, maintained better law and order than most states that came before it, and reduced a lot of internal violence, during which markets were united, trade could grow, ideas could grow, huge amount of ideas grew. Nobody talks about the influence of Persian thought into China that came during that period. Most of it happened during that time. everybody was at pains to point out that violence has been a critical part of the state. Pacifism just doesn't come in. So I don't think there's any room for pacifism or, you know, an airy-fairy, namby-pamby approach to security.
I'm going to come to you, sir. Oh,
So I'll just add to that.
One sec, Sanjeev, we are very short of time.
Okay.
I'm going to make a small investment with Lalit, because the amount of time Lalit takes, and because he's one of the members who's organizing this, we are going to take double the time from you. So yeah, please quickly ask your question, Lalit.
Let him ask and then we'll bring it back.
Okay,
We'll
bring it
answer
to you.
them together.
Yeah, so my question is again to Abhijit. So how does the Indian military establishment view itself? That is, whether it's an army of invasion and occupation, army to defend, or forces to defend the realm, or forces to create shock and awe. Because there are three, that will guide the entire procurement, training, all those processes. So how does it view itself?
Quick, Abhijit.
Okay, I thought we were collecting the Westerns. Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm going to disappoint you with a very simple answer. I've worked with them for 15 years, and the answer is none of the above. If you ask the army who the enemy is,
Question actually.
no, it's you ask the army what the enemy is. They'll tell you number one is the Air Force, number two is the Navy. You ask the Navy who the enemy is, they'll tell you it's the Army and the Air Force, and the Navy will tell you something similar.
So basically a work in progress?
No work in progress.
No work, no progress.
One case.
Respecting the time, I'm going to condense my question. One of the hallmarks of Bharat Shakti is something that we have glazed through, but Sri Aurobindo has said that in the early last century that we are a superpower in governance, in economics, in finance, in administration. But in the process, if we lose our main heritage, the hallmark of India and the Bharat Shakti, and that is its spiritual heritage, it will be not only a great loss for our country but also to the whole world. And he also mentioned reassuringly that this will surely not happen. We have touched upon governance, finance, security, but the heritage, which is the hallmark of India, the spiritual heritage, few words. Thank you.
Okay. You want to take that?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Sanjeev.
First of all, I am not a votary of deterministic history. It is not predetermined that we will come back as a great civilization. It's not predetermined that we will come back as a great economy. It is not predetermined that we will not lose our civilizational links to our past. All of this requires hard work and sacrifice. This has to be invested into. So while Sri Aurobindo is obviously relying on somebody in subsequent generations to do this, and maybe they will, but the point is, this is not happening naturally. This requires a lot of hard work, continuously, generation after generation after generation. And he is effectively saying, so in this way, I disagree with Sri Aurobindo in that the way he has stated, at least the way you stated it, seems to suggest that this is something that will naturally happen. I do not believe it happens naturally. In fact, he himself in his own lifetime showed that first to winning political freedom and then later into investing into civilizational continuity and so on. He himself believed in leadership and actually putting in the investment. Every society has to invest. Just like we invest in roads, we have to invest into our civilizational continuity. Unfortunately, as Bibekda just pointed out, we have not bothered to translate 95% of our texts. And by the way, this is just for the Sanskrit text. There are Pali texts, there are lots of debates going on all kinds of issues related to, say, the Maratha Empire. But the Peshwai in Pune has literally tens of thousands of texts relating to the Maratha Empire in the Modi script, which has not been translated. Nobody bothers to do this. Similarly, it required a foreigner, William Dalrymple, to go into the archives of Delhi and pull out all those texts relating to, in old Urdu and Persian, relating to the 1857 revolt. Whereas it's such an important period in our history, and yet all the correspondence of Bahadur Shah Zafar was lying around till just a decade ago. It required somebody from outside to come and pull it out and translate it. So this is a major, major problem.
Thanks, Sanjeev. There were some hands there, but I'm going to have a reservation for women. If there are any women who want to ask questions, the panel is full of men. The questions, those who are asking the questions are men. Any women who would like to ask a question? Nobody? Okay, sir. Right. Over to you.
No, you use the mic.
Use the mic, please.
This is actually a question to Mr. Debroy. So the idea of Ram Rajya, is it a civilizational idea, historical in nature, or is it just merely a political idea?
What, sorry?
Ram Rajya.
The idea of Ram Rajya.
The idea of Ram Rajya as articulated in the Valmiki Ramayana or as in the conception of some people, there is a difference between the two. But let me interpret it in the way it is depicted in the texts. And the way it is depicted in Valmiki Ramayana when Rama ruled is not remarkably different from the way it is depicted at the time Dasharatha ruled. The question that is asked of Yudhishthira by Narada when it turns up in the Mahabharata about ruling the kingdom is also that template for governance. So therefore, inherently in all of this, and how much time do we have? I just want to react to the earlier one.
We are almost done, but you can.
I just want
quickly
to react to the earlier one, and then if we have time, I'll give you an anecdote from the Valmiki Ramayana. You see, mention gods and goddesses. Gods and goddesses suggest avatars coming down to us. Yada yada hi dharmasya. That's not what Sri Aurobindo is about. Sri Aurobindo is about uplifting ourselves. So yes, there is no deterministic path because it depends on whether we do that upliftment without waiting for the avatar to come down to us. Quick anecdote from the Ramayana, because I think you'll love it even if it leads to exceeding the time limit. This is from the Uttar Kanda, by the way, which is regarded as a later interpolation, does not matter. Ram Rajya is prevailing, everyone is happy in the kingdom, rains happen at the right time, there is no famine, there is no drought, people do not die untimely deaths. But nonetheless, in case there is a complaint, Lakshmana is every day supposed to go out and see if anyone has come with a complaint. Along comes the dog. And what is the dog's problem? The dog was peacefully sleeping on a road. Along came a Brahmana, and the dog was in its path. The Brahmana should have simply asked the dog to move, and the dog would have moved according to the dog, but the Brahmana did no such thing, beat the dog on the head with a stick. So the dog came and said, I have a complaint. Lakshmana said, a dog cannot go to the king. Dog said, what is this? This is Ram Rajya, I must be allowed to go to the king. So Lakshmana goes and consults Rama, and the dog is taken to Rama, and the dog relates this story. The Brahman is summoned, and the Brahmana says, yes, I have been guilty, and I should have asked the dog to move. Instead, it is true, I beat the dog on the head with the stick. So the dog says, you must punish a Brahmana. Rama asks all the advisors and ministers, they say, no, you cannot punish a Brahmana. So Rama asks the dog, what do you suggest I do? The dog says, make this Brahmana the Kuladhipati, the Lord of Kalinjar, which still exists. Make him the Lord of Kalinjar, the Kuladhipati of Kalinjar. The Brahmana goes off on an elephant. Everyone is puzzled, and the ministers say, what is this? You were supposed to punish the Brahmana, you have rewarded him. And Rama says, in Ram Rajya, dogs are more clever and wise than the ministers and the advisors. Dog, tell them. The dog says, in my last life, I was the Kuladhipati of Kalinjar. Anyone who is the Kuladhipati of Kalinjar has plenty of avenues for corruption and taking bribes. So he was condemned to be born as a dog in this life, and this is exactly what is going to happen to the Brahmana.
Fabulous. Fantastic story.
Thank you. Can we quickly have some closing remarks? Abhijit?
No closing remarks.
Sanjeev?
No, I have a slightly different view of Ram Rajya, which fits with this. But the thing is, I think the point about Ram Rajya is not so much that it is paradise. It is not the kingdom of God as it became later on. It is the place where even the ruler applies the law to himself. And that is the point about the Uttara Ramayana being inserted into the Ramayana, essentially to make the place, and it is a part of an ancient debate about the rule of law. And he said, what is Ram Rajya? It's the place where the king applies the law to himself, even when the law may actually be unfair. So it is not, even in the Ramayana, as if the law is seen as being fair, and the sending away of Sita is clearly seen as unfair even in the Ramayana. It's not like they justifies it. And Ram then spends the rest of his life being unhappy and pining for Sita, and yet he had to apply the law to himself. And it's quite interesting, therefore, in taking into the present context, is that Ram Rajya is that place where the ruling dynasties apply the law to themselves. Incidentally, not everybody, and even in ancient times, agreed with this conception of an ideal state. And so the debate is with the Mahabharata, where Krishna applies not the law, but he keeps twisting it. So there is a conception in there of some sort of a natural justice idea, not just the word of the law. So it's quite an interesting debate, in my view, in ancient times between the idea of natural justice and the word of the law. So, I mean, it's a debate for another day, but these debates between Kautilya and Ashoka, between Ram and Krishna in the conception of our political thought, and sadly has been lost largely over time and is pretty much not taught anyway.
I'm very tempted to get 2-3 more questions, but we are out of time, and this person here in the green sari is giving me bad and very ugly glares. I'm sorry to have to end this session right here, and I don't think we have a conclusion, and that's what I think the Indian thought is all about, that there is no one right thing or one particular way of doing things. I think the Indian way, the Bharat Shakti, allows each soul to express itself from the depths of his or her Swadharma. And with that thought, I leave you. Thank you very much. The panelists are here for further discussions should you want them. Thank you very much.